I would like to welcome everybody on behalf of the organizing committee of the Minoan seminar, on behalf of Sapouna-Sakellaraki, Lefteris Platon, Yiannis Papadatos, and myself. WOLF-DIETRICH is very well known to all of us in Athens, particularly from his time as assistant director and director of the German Archaeological Institute of Athens. He's excavated extensively, notably at the Keramikos, at Kalapodi, Tel Kabri, Heraion at Samos, and at Miletus, where he seems to have found the Minoans from the very beginning of the Neopalatial period. Although he has not excavated at Knossos, his first major work was on the palace-style pottery of Knossos. From that stemmed his studies of the throne room and the Priest King fresco, which is his subject today. His views on the destruction of the palace at Knossos in late Minoan 3b are well known, but today he tackles once again, perhaps a very much easier topic, rethinking the Priest King stucco relief from Knossos, Minoan kingship and religion. So I'll hand over to you immediately, Wolf, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. And the first slide, please. Can we start the slides?
Yeah.
I would like to dedicate this presentation to the memory of two eminent scholars and personal friends, Sinclair Hood and Robin Hagg. Please allow me some personal memories. Sinclair Hood, the grand seigneur of Minoan archaeology, who passed away 2 months ago in the biblical age of 101 years, I first met at the Third Cretological Conference in Heraklion in 1976. This was my first international conference, and when I gave my paper on the results of my dissertation on the Palestine pottery from Knossos, many scholars, which had known before to me only from literature, were sitting in the audience. Among others, also Peter Warren, I remember, I think. I was so nervous that my knees were shaking. Fortunately, people couldn't see that because I was standing behind a lectern. After the lecture, Sinclair Hood came to me, shook my hand, and congratulated me. You can imagine that leaving the audience hall, I felt like floating on a cloud. Later, Sinclair and I became friends. Several times my wife Barbara and I enjoyed the hospitality in Rachel and Sinclair Hood's wonderful house, the Old Vicarage in Great Milton near Oxford. There we had pleasant evenings with stimulating discussions also with other Oxford scholars, Gerald and Lucy Cadogan and Mervyn Popham. Sinclair was a very open-minded scholar and loved discussions. I remember that he said once in a conference, "May we never agree, otherwise it's getting boring." Robin Hagg and Nano Marinatos I met first at the Cambridge Colloquium on Minoan Society in 1981. We became immediately friends. When I, in 1983, got for the first time a position at the German Archaeological Institute in Athens, I had to pass a month of probation. Normally, I would have had to stay during that time in the guest room of the German Institute, but Nano and Robin invited me to stay with them in their apartment. That was a wonderful time. Every evening when I returned from work, we used to sit together with a tea and discuss until deep into the night about my known religion. One of Robin's and Nano's great merits is the organization and fast and excellent publication of the now legendary International Symposia at the Swedish Institute in Athens, a model for our Minoan seminar. This was born in 2003 during a dinner in Colin's apartment with him, Peter Warren, Eric and Birgitta Halaga, and myself. Soon, Yiannis and Sapouna-Sakellaraki joined the group. And with Yiannis, of course, we miss very much another eminent scholar of Minoan archaeology. But now we come to the representation. Next. Next. Here again the title, and next. Next. The object of this presentation is a painted stucco relief. No, back, one back. The object of this presentation is a painted stucco relief of the Priest King, also named Lily Prince, Prince with Lily Crown, Prince with Feather Crown in different languages, from Knossos, from now only simply Priest King, representing a young man striding to his right with his right arm bent in front of his chest, his left one stretched out backwards, naked except for a belt and a loincloth with codpiece, wearing a necklace of vase lilies from shoulder to shoulder across his chest, and a crown with vase lilies and plumes on his head. To the left in the exhibition in the Heraclean Museum, to the right in a version with a field of iris flowers and a butterfly in flat paint, through which he is strolling as a colored frontispiece in the second volume of 1928 of Arthur Evans's monumental 4 volumes book, The Palace of Minos at Knossos. The Priest King is the most popular icon of Crete. Next. Next. Hosts of copies of him have gone throughout the world. They are sold as replicas, posters, and postcards, decorate tourist souvenirs, and welcome worldwide the clients in Cretan restaurants. Next.
Next. Don't worry, it takes some time sometimes.
Okay. The Priest King formed the logo of the Cretan shipping company Minoan Lines and decorates the chimneys of its ferry boats. And next. As well as the covers of fantasy novels set in Minoan Crete and of a recent handbook on the Bronze Age of the Aegean. In the parade of Hellenic history from the Bronze Age to the present at the opening ceremony of the 2004 Olympic Games in Athens, a male model in the costume of the Priest King represented Minoan Crete. Next. The Priest King formed also the icon for Arthur Evans's ideas about sacred kingship at Knossos. In the introduction to the first volume of 1921 of The Palace of Minos at Knossos, Evans described his vision. Next. A Minoan priest king may have sat upon the throne at Knossos, the adopted son on earth of the great mother of its island mysteries. Next. Such a personage indeed, we may actually recognize in the palace relief of a figure wearing a plumed crown, lily crown, and leading, we may believe, the sacred griffin. When publishing the final reconstruction of the Priest King, stucco relief in 1928, Evans stated that in the representation, I quote, "We may with good reasons recognize one of the actual Priest Kings of Knossos. That means Minos himself in one of his mortal incarnation, who moves in Elysian fields amidst mystic blooms and butterflies from another sphere." Next. The plumed lily crown became the emblem of Evans' vision of sacred kingship at Knossos and was gilded onto the cover of each of the 4 volumes of the Palace of Minos at Knossos. Next. Evans thought that the left hand of the Priest King held, I quote, held some kind of cord or thong by which he was depicted as leading a sacred animal. End of quote. For Evans, there could be little doubt that the sacred animal in question would have been a griffin. There is, however, no evidence either for the existence of this griffin or for the cord, which is a modern addition to the figure. Next. According to Evans, the Priest King with the griffin was leading the procession painted on the walls of the corridor of the procession, which, after running southwards from the west porch, turned eastwards and finally northwards into the south-north corridor, connecting the corridor of the procession with the south front of the central court. The Priest King, so Evans, adorned the east wall of the south-north corridor before that opened out into the central court. Next. The outlet of the south-north corridor, as imagined by Evans, was constructed in 1926 with a paved floor, the partly erected side walls, and a replica of the Priest King on the eastern one. Evans described, I quote, "The painted relief of the Priest King with a crown of lily crests and peacock plumes that had fallen from a wall of a corridor leading up to the central court from the south has been replaced by a stucco facsimile in the place it had occupied." Next. There is, however, no evidence for the existence of Evans's south-north corridor. The area between the south front of the central court and the space in which the stucco relief fragments were found had been substantially disturbed in post-Minoan times, and no architectural remnants were preserved. Next. The construction without any evidence for the existence of the outlet of the South-North corridor with a copy of the Priest King, formed part of a program that Evans carried out between 1922 and 1930, called by him reconstitutions, in which Knossos was transformed, often beyond what the preserved remains reasonably permitted it, from poorly preserved ruins into a multiple-stored colorful vision constructed with concrete of what Evans believed the palace had looked like. Evans stated, I quote, "But it seemed a duty of the excavator to preserve, wherever practical, the history of the building by replacing in situ, even when it entailed some reconstitution of the walls, replicas of the frescoes designed as completely from existing fragments." Next. Happily, in attaining this desirable result, I had at hand the invaluable services of the artist, Monsieur Émile Gillian-Fil, who has practiced skill in reproducing the masterpieces of my known art in the preceding volumes of this work, The Palace of Minos at Knossos, and bear sufficient evidence. Next. In this way, by no other means, it has been possible to preserve something of the inner life of the old palace sanctuary to a degree, with, it may be fairly said, more considerable than in any case of any other great monument of antiquity. Criticism on Evans' reconstitutions, which according to Peter Warren, to quote, would today be called outreach, by archaeologists, architects, and other visitors began at the outset of these works and increased later considerably. The Austrian archaeologist Camillo Praschnicker criticized, I quote, the by far exaggerated construction which make the venerable site to a kind of movie decoration. There are indeed several misleading reconstitutions. Next, I show here only one example, the so-called Queen's Megaron, often re-illustrated as example of my known living comfort. It never looked like today. The fragments of the dolphin fresco and the so-called dancing lady were not found in the room, but in the light well to the east, where they had fallen from the upper story, most probably from a cult room as discussed by Ute Günkel-Maschek. Moreover, the dolphin fresco probably had not decorated a wall, but a floor. Next. During the closing for renovation of the Heraklion Archaeological Museum, a large re-exhibition program of its collections took place in the years between 2010 and 2014 under the directorship of my now for 45 years friend Yorgos Rethymiotakis. 9,500 objects were selected for the new exhibition and meticulously cleaned and conserved. One of the most difficult aspects of the task was the cleaning of the frescoes from the dirt that had covered their surface as a result of their exposure to the adverse and unstable conditions of humidity, dust, and temperature fluctuation in the old exhibition, and their conservation with appropriate chemical and acrylic stabilizers. Together with the other murals, the Priest King, with all his details, is now much better visible than before, also due to the new excellent lighting in the exhibition hall. New important observations made during the restoration of the Priest King by Yorgos Rethymiotakis and the conservator Eleni Papadaki, and I would like to thank both of them warmly for sharing these with me. The controversies in the recent decades about the Priest King, Minoan kingship and religion, warrant a new discussion of the stucco relief. As I shall argue, the Priest King as we see him today is not a genuine Minoan work of art of the second millennium BC, but a pasticcio made in the 1920s AD with non-joining fragments from at least 3 different figures by Émile Gillian-Fil. For a better understanding of how Gillian's reconstruction of the Priest King came about, we need to go back to Knossos in the very beginning of the 20th century. Next. The fragments later combined to the figure were unearthed between 11th and 16th May of 1901 in a basement space to the south of the central court. On the map of Sinclair Hood and David Smith to the left, number 9, in depth between 30 centimeters and 2 meters 20. As Duncan Mackenzie, Evans field director, reported meticulously in his excavation daybook. Mackenzie's description shows that Evans' statement, according to which the fragments were uncovered, I quote, above the floor level of this room near its east wall from about a meter below the surface, is incorrect. Mackenzie described that no floor was preserved in this room down to the Neolithic level 3 meters below the surface. Next. Here a photograph of the cast of fragments which can help, here we are, which can help to liberate us from Gillian Field's reconstruction of the Priest King, which has determined our imagination for such a long time. These fragments are, next, first, a fragment of the upper part of the head with the upper part of the left ear with helix and antihelix, and a crown described subsequently. Helmut Bossert observed in 1921 that the skin color of the head fragment is yellowish white. Today the area around the ear is unfortunately covered by old solubles and fixing materials that have obscured the original color. According to Eleni Papadaki, it looks, however, more pale than the skin color of the torso. I shall come back to this fact. On the ear, traces of red color were distinguished in higher resolution analysis photographs. Also to this I shall come back later. The crown consists of a blue and red circlet in which 5 white lilies consisting of a combination of white lower petals with red dotted fringes, red eyes, and a blue upper umbel adapted from papyrus are fixed. From a larger vase lily in the center of the crown rise through long plumes, a gray, a yellowish green, and a blue one. Next. Second, the frontal torso with a bent right arm and fist tightly against the chest. Hold tightly against the chest. The right pectoral muscle contracted, the left one extending. The skin color of the torso has caused controversial discussions. According to Evans, I quote, the skin was originally colored in a reddish-brown hue like that of men in the frescoes, though this has much faded. Nikolaos Platon has reported in 1959 to have seen traces of rosy color. According to Mark Cameron, the color of the skin was white. Yorgos Rethemiotakis has kindly informed me about recent investigation, and I quote him. Indeed, there are traces of color on the skin, actually stains, which should not be confused with the solubles used by the conservators in the past, most of which were carefully removed during the new conservation. The stains are the result of the discoloration and the partial penetration of the pigment into the surface of the plaster when it was still wet. Nothing of the original color is preserved, and it probably did not last long, as it did not successfully penetrate the surface, whereas the other colors employed, red and blue, held better and are still quite visible. The brown-red pigment, iron oxide, according to the conservator, achieves deeper penetration, which automatically exclude this color for being selected, the selected color of the skin of the torso. Next. You may compare them with the similar relief fresco fragments from the Great East Hall. The red skin is still partly preserved. Next. That means Yorgos Rethemiotakis' view, is that the color is neither brown nor white. I believe that the color employed by Gillian Field in the restored parts, now visible in the newly restored Priest King as seen in the exhibition, something between beige salmon, is close to reality. Partly faded adornments of the torso are the necklace of red vase lilies with blue beads between them from shoulder to shoulder across his chest, a blue collar around the neck, and a broad blue bracelet on the wrist of the right arm. Next. These adornments were restored by Evans in a photograph by, as he said, chromatic manipulation. Here you see, and next, here you see the original photograph of 1901 before the chromatic manipulations. Evans thought that the vase lilies of the necklace had been attached by means of some superficial layer, either colored to represent metalwork or even consisting of gold foil, and that after the detachment of this layer, the originally ruddy hue of the skin came out again, whereas it was faded on the rest of the torso. Similarly, Maria Shaw considered possibly that the lilies might have been rendered in white impasto, edit al secco, on the already dry red color of the skin. As Ellen Davis has stated, we have, however, no evidence that precious metal was ever added to Aegean murals. And according to Yorgos Rathimutakis and his team, no evidence does exist for any gold foil or colors having been added on the vase lilies of the necklace. Thus, the red and blue point of the necklace were the original colors. Next. Also, the long so-called Libyan side locks, you see them below, of hair falling down in front of the chest and beneath the clenched hand, were restored by chromatic manipulation. According to Evans, I quote, "These locks are best traceable by the appearance of slightly incised sinuous lines that mark their margin." Next, not next. There is, however, for the loss. As Mutakis has kindly informed me, the museum spent much time in the laboratory investigating with the aid of magnifying lenses and digital photographs to see if something of the side locks exist, color or trace lines. The answer is negative. Next. Third.
Can I ask you to speak a little slower, a little bit slower for the connection? It helps a little bit slower.
Okay, I will. Next. A fragment of the left upper arm to the right. And next. Parts of the blue belt, fourth, parts of the blue belt, and fifth, parts of the blue codpiece of a man facing right. The white sliding pant leg on the right thigh is an addition in the reconstruction without evidence for its evidence, as discussed by Effie Sapouna-Sakellaraki. And next, sixth, the thigh of the left leg of a man facing right with part of the loincloth with a blue and red band. Seventh, the lower part of the left leg of a man facing right in the center. And eighth, the fragment of the upper part of another leg on the right. Next, three further fragments belong to the flat painted background of the composition. Ninth, two parts of stylized iris flowers. Since their background is yellow, Evans supposed that part of the priest king had a yellow background. The spiral terminations of the lower petals and the buds were completed on the analogy of the terminal coils of the papyrus sprays on a Palestine amphora from the royal tomb at Isopata, and 10 fragments of a butterfly with red background. Next. By 1893, Evans saw in a note, I quote, "Crete a center of earliest Greek state. Minos may have played great part in spreading this culture," end of quote. Thus, legendary King Minos had already been a historical figure to Evans before he started his excavations at Knossos in 1900. And the roots of Hellenism were, according to him, to be found in Crete. At Knossos, Evans looked eagerly for evidence of the existence of King Minos and claimed in 1901 to have found it. In a report to the Times, Evans wrote the following about the fragments. Next. I quote, "The head supplies insignia of still more royal support. It displays the upper part of the head wearing a crown, which terminates above in a row of 5 sloping lilies of varied metalwork, with a higher one rising in the center. That the fleur-de-lis of our Edwards and Henrys should find a prototype in prehistoric Greece is a startling revelation. But it was perhaps fitting that, as last year's excavation in Knossos brought to light the older throne in Europe below, so the more recent researches should produce its most ancient crown." In his official report on the discovery of the fragments, Evans in BSA 1901-2 voiced, I quote, "the real presumption that in this crowned head we see for us a Mycenaean king." End of quote. At the beginning of the excavation, Evans followed the at that time usual convention Mycenaean to designate the Bronze Age antiquities found in Crete. Only from 1902 onwards did he begin using consistently the term Minoan, which is a translation from the German term minoisch, coined by the German scholar Karl Höck in 1828. Next. Evans first believed that the fragments had belonged to three different figures, that the crown belonged to a Mycenaean king looking to his right, and that of the torso belonged to a boxer acting to his left. Finally, the thigh and the greater part of a leg to a third man oriented to his right. Evans got the idea to identify the torso as that of a boxer certainly from the representation of a boxer on the fragment of a conical serpentine rhyton found in the same year in the court of the stone spout, right. 2 years later, the Mycenaean king was converted to the priest king. Evans argued that since an important selection of the palace represented an extensive sanctuary and its dependencies, I quote, there was a sacerdotal as well as a royal side to the Minoan dynasty of Knossos, end of quote. Soon afterwards, the figure of the priest king, quote, was born of disparate limbs united to satisfy Evans's need for an earthly authority, as Alexander MacGillivray has put it, or as Barry Unsworth has ironically written, who would be content with a barrow load of plastered chips when he could make out a prince of it? Next. In 1904, Evans reported that Émile Gillian Père has made, I quote, a restoration of the entire figure of what was not improbably one of the priest kings of Knossos, end of quote. There were two versions of this restoration, that in the first exhibition hall of the Archaeological Museum of Candia Heraklion left was made with the original fragments mounted on a monochrome red background, the other one in the Ishmaelian Museum in Oxford in a replica of plaster of Paris with a flat painted background. To the right, this is a copy in the Humboldt University of Berlin. In Gillian Pére's reconstruction, the priest king's restored left arm is bent upwards at the elbow and differs from that of his son. In the father's version, the left hand is grasping a staff, a long one in the version at the Heraklion Museum, a short one in the version of the Ishmaelian Museum. Next. As I have argued already elsewhere, in the reconstruction of Émile Gillian Père, the attitude of the figure, as well as the field of lilies forming the background and based only on two small fragments of blossoms, reflect the artistic spirit of Art Nouveau. That means of the period in which Gillian Père, who had got his artistic education at the Kunstakademie in Munich and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, was active. To the right, a Ver Sacrum card by Karl Moser and the design for a case by G.M. Auchenthaler. Next. As stated by John Forsyth, the staff of the reconstructions of the priest king by Gillian Père was certainly inspired by the staff held by the prince of the chieftain cup from Ayer Triada. And next, in the discussion of Gillian Field's new reconstruction, also Evans has emphasized the relationship of the priest king to the prince of the chieftain cup, but he did not give a reason why in the new version the staff of the first version had been taken away and instead a griffin to guide was suggested. The great majority of scholars accepted over the decades Gillian Field's reconstruction and Evans' interpretation. Next, Mark Cameron criticized the reconstruction partly on detail, partly on its overall flavor, but his reconstruction is only subtly different of it. Next, in 1960, André Dessène saw in the representation of a man leading a sphinx on an ivory pyxis from Zuntas Chamber Tomb 49 at Mycenae, a copy of the priest king, and thought that the mythical creature guided by the priest king was not a griffin but a sphinx. His hypothesis was accepted by several scholars. The pyxis is in a very bad state of preservation. The sphinx wears a crown, but the man has no extant headdress and appears to carry an object on his shoulder which leaves no space for a headdress. Moreover, his right arm is raised, another clear difference to the bent right arm of the priest king's torso. Next. In 1969, Stylianos Alexiou saw in the representation of a male figure with a griffin on a spindle-shaped sardonic cylinder seal from Eastern Crete in the Heraclean Museum, a parallel supporting Evans's vision of the priest king guiding a griffin. The presentation on the seal is, however, very different. The griffin is in front of the man who holds him on a long leash. The male figure's attitude is completely different from that of the priest king, and he does not wear a plumed lily crown. The seal is broken at the upper end, but it is clear that there was no space for a crown like that of the priest king. And next, the circa 650 preserved fragments of painted stucco reliefs from Knossos, studied and published in 1976 by Bernd Kaiser, here some better preserved examples of them, are very fragmentary and disparate, and most of them were not found worthy of publication by Evans. No other complete human figure could be reconstructed from them, and the priest king, as I said, was made up from non-joining pieces. I wonder, after all, why Kaiser did not accept in this thorough study of the Knossian stucco reliefs any doubt about Gilles Field's reconstruction of the priest king. Actually, only few scholars have criticized the reconstructions of the figure by the Gillians. The first one who raised doubts about the combination of the torso and the lily crown was Helmut Bossert in 1921. Next, he stated aptly that similar crowns are worn by sphinxes and women, pointing to the woman with crown on the sarcophagus from Agia Triada, often interpreted as priestess, by Nano Marinatos as queen. We shall come back later to this. Never by male figures. Therefore, and because of the yellowish-white skin color of the head observed by him, Bossert thought that the crown belonged to a female figure. Next, most interestingly, Evans mentioned in connection with the priest king the plumed crowns of sphinxes, but not that of the priestess queen on the Agia Triada sarcophagus. Her crown was used by Evans instead for his reconstruction of the figure of a goddess in the procession fresco. There is, however, no evidence for the existence of that crown, since only the lowest part of the fresco had survived on the wall, as you can see on the picture below. Next, the Belgian painter Norbert Schapens, under his pseudonym Nordjorkam, published in 1967 a provocative reconstruction of the priest king's stucco relief as Marche nuptiale, in which the priest king guides the princess, great priestess of the snake cult. There is, however, no evidence for this reconstruction. The second ear of another person seen by Nordjorkam does not exist. The left biceps, in the elevation of which Nordjorkam sees a female breast, is in fact a modern addition. The snake Nordjorkam has given in the left hand of his princess is in fact the robe added by Gilles Fiel for leading a griffin. I refrain here from discussing suggestions that the priest king's stucco relief represents a female. As a crowned princess of the bull ring, leading a bull into the ring, the central court, Mark Cameron, 1970. As woman and priestess leading the long procession of the corridor, Jared Cadogan, 1976. As priestess queen having herself depicted as a male, Louis Hitchcock, 2000. Or as belonging to several female bull leapers, perhaps shown in procession, Ellen Davis, 1995, because these interpretations are based on the wrong assumption that the skin color of the priest king was white. As described before, the skin of the priest king's torso was not white, but most probably beige salmon. As early as 1915, Richard Seeger has suggested that the lighter skin, the usual color for men's skin is red, is probably a mark of higher rank, as in Egyptian paintings, where the royal persons often have a much brighter color of the skin than their subjects. Nicholas Platon has interpreted the rosy skin color observed by him as a possible indication of nobility, Evgenia. Next, a confirmation of this theory is provided by the boxing boys fresco from building Beta at Acroterio on Fira. The skin color of the face of the left boy is lighter than the red-brown one of the right boy. The left boy is wearing jewelry, earrings, bracelet, anklet, and a necklace, whereas the right boy has nothing of this. Thus, the left boy must be of higher rank according to Nano Marinatus. The lighter skin color of his face appears to be a further sign of this. Next, to return to the Gillians restoration, in 1978, Sinclair Hood has been skeptical about the belongingness of the fragments. I quote, "The restoration is not certain, and the fragments may come from 2 or 3 different figures, as Evans originally supposed. Although I was always impressed by the priest king when I stood in front of him in the Heraclean Museum for the first time long time ago in 1966, there was something wrong with him to me, but I did not realize what. The scales fall from my eyes when the French physician and anatomist Jean Coulomb published in 1979 his study Le Prince au lait de Knossos reconsidéré." Next. He observed clear differences in the positions of the 2 grand pectoral muscles, whereas the priest king's right one is contracted with the arm bent in front of the lower part of the chest. The muscular mass of his left one is stretched up. According to Coulomb's expert statement illustrated with an anatomical drawing and a photograph of a living model, the extension of the left pectoral muscle implies that the corresponding arm must have had an ascending position. Next. Apparently, this was clear at the beginning to Evans himself when he thought that the torso had belonged to a boxer, and even after the vision of the priest king had been born. 2 undated pencil sketches of the priest king in one of Evans's notebooks kept in the Schmerli Museum in Oxford show the crowned figure in an attitude similar to Gillian Paire's reconstruction, but with one marked difference. The left arm is raised sharply upwards to level well above the head. He holds a long object interpreted by Susan Sherratt. On the larger sketch left is a long downward pointing sword. On the smaller one, second from the left, is a long staff or pole with an ornamental floral head. According to Sherratt, the sketches can be seen to stand right on the cusp of the development from Evans's notion of 3 or more separate figures to one single figure, and right on the cusp of the development from his idea of a Mycenaean king to that of a priest king, combining political and religious functions in one ruler. Sherratt thinks that Evans has drawn the sketches sometime in 1903 after having seen the prince holding a staff scepter on the chieftain cup on the right, discovered between February and July 1903 at Agia Triada. Evans certainly soon realized that the distorted stance of the figure in his sketches is unconvincing. Next. But retaining his vision of the priest king, he and the Gillians gave to the left arm a downward direction. In the final discussion of the priest king in 1928, Evans stated surprisingly, I think against one's better judgment, I quote, "From the faint muscular indications supplied by the small remaining part of the left arm, it seems to have been engaged in a downward action." Coulomb argued that because of the ascending position of the left arm, the figure to which the torso had belonged must have had acted not to its right, but to its left, and that the head with the crown looking to its right cannot have belonged to the same figure. The latter statement is confirmed by the apparent different color of head and torso described above. As Yorgos Rethymiotakis informs me, he and Eleni Papadaki agree that head and torso do not seem to belong to the same figure. Next. Coulomb thought that all the fragments belonged to debris brought during the reoccupation period from somewhere else to their final find place. I think, however, that the fragments were found together in one basement room and put together from many pieces of stucco, the torso from 19, the crown from 21, had fallen together from a room above. As will be discussed later, the vase lily motif links the crown with the necklace of the torso, suggesting that they belong to the same composition. Next, Coulomb returned to Evans's first interpretation and described the priest king torso to a boxer. As parallel, he compared a boxer on the so-called boxer rhiton from Agia Triada. Although I was convinced of Coulombe's observation concerning the pectoral muscle of the torso, his interpretation of it as that of a boxer did not convince me. There is a clear difference between the attitude traditionnelle, as Coulombe calls the attitude of the boxer on the boxer rhiton, chosen by him as parallel to the priest king's torso, and the attitude of the latter. Whereas the boxer on the boxer rhiton has taken back his right arm, the right arm of the priest king's torso is bent in front of the chest. Coulombe interpreted this as a position of defense for protecting the liver. Next, the boxers with Coulombe's attitude traditionnelle on the Agia Triada rhiton, numbers 4 and 5, on the fragment of a rhiton from the court of the stone spout at Knossos already seen, number 2, and on a seal impression from the East Temple repository at Knossos, number 3, do not need, however, to protect their liver, since their opponents are already knocked down. Where both boxes are still active, the fight is an open exchange of blows with both arms, as in another boxing scene on the Agia Triada boxer rhiton, number 6, and in the fresco of the boxing boys from Akrotiri on Thera, number 7. In Minoan iconography, human figures adopt a limited range of communicative gestures as demonstrated by Livia Morgan. Since the fragmentary state of preservation of frescoes and stucco reliefs does often not allow to define the iconography of large-scale mural scenes, the figural scenes in Minoan glyptic scenes form an important source of information. Next, in regard to the priest king, the scales fall from my eyes a second time when Yiannis and Eric Hallager presented in 1984 at the Fourth International Symposium at the Swedish Institute in Athens the clay impression of a gold ring found in the Greek-Swedish excavations in Chania, named the Master Impression. It was published 1 year later in a masterly analysis by Eric Hallager. The male master, naked except a loincloth with belt, and a codpiece of Epi Sapouna-Sakellaraki type Zeta, with boots decorated with horizontal incisions, with the left arm bent against the upper part of the body, and the right arm outstretched with his hand holding a long staff, in a position of commanding gesture well known from other representation, which will be discussed later, is represented as being oversized and as standing on top of an architectural complex atop a rock. With Kathleen Crettenmaker, I think that this architectural complex is a palace and not a town, because all parts of it are crowned by horns of consecration, which are found in the representations of palaces and sanctuaries, but not of ordinary houses. Next, the master of the Master Impression forms a close parallel to the torso of the priest king, wearing similar decorations around his neck and arms, a necklace, as well as broad bracelets, at the upper arms, not extant as the priest king, and wrists. The 1987 reconstruction of the priest king's torso by my wife Barbara and me has followed the prototype of the Master Impression. Next. In 1987, I have interpreted our reconstruction as representation of a god and proposed 3 possible reconstructions of the entire scene with the other fragments found together with the torso. First, if the lily crown was worn by a human female, this may have been a priestess approaching and adoring the god, accompanied by a man to whom the right leg walking to the left belonged. Second, if the lily crown was worn by a sphinx, this creature may have been guided to the god by a man to whom the right leg walking to the left belonged. And third, if the lily crown was worn by a sphinx, a second possibility would be that the god may have been flanked in the scheme of the master of animals by 2 sphinxes. At that time I have favored solution 2, but in between I have changed my mind, as you will see. Our reconstruction of the figure was on the one hand accepted by several scholars, on the other hand found ingenious but risky and not bound to be definitive by others, or the evidence was found to be too fragmentary for a definite reconstruction. In 2004, a new study of the Priest King, Maria Shaw, rejecting Coulombe's and my reconstructions, reported her observations made of the torso from a tall ladder. Next, especially that of a small fragment joining the torso at the junction of neck and right shoulder, marked by the arrow on the right, and the fragment you see on the left. After the recent cleaning of the torso and the new lighting, the details on that fragment described by Shaw, but not visible on the photographs published by her, are clearly visible again. A small area of the skin at the base of the neck, a part of the blue collar above the lily necklace, as well as a small part of the flat red background, where both Coulombe and I had black hair in our reconstruction. Therefore, Shaw is right in stating that there was no hair at this spot. Next. For my reconstruction, I had used the first photograph of the torso taken in 1901, before the fragment in question had been joined to the torso, and had overlooked that both Gillian Père and Fiel had integrated this fragment in their reconstructions. Next, Maria Shaw concluded that Evans and Gillian Fiel had been right in reconstructing the figure with the head turning to his right, and not to his left, as in Coulombe's and my reconstructions. She readapted Evans's and Gillian Fiel's reconstruction with one difference. The missing left arm was, according to her, swinging back down. In her reconstruction, it is even more lowered than in that of Gillian Fiel. Shaw has interpreted her reconstruction of the Priest King as a representation of the top athlete in bull leaping, a kind of present-day gold medalist, having won the crown as a prize of victory and parading at the head of a procession in the closing ceremonies. According to her, the athlete of the year may have been treated like a prince, perhaps targeted as the possible future ruler. Nano Marinatos has voiced in 2007, I quote, that we owe it to Maria Shaw that the King of the Lilies got back his crown, end of quote. And Chapin has stated in 2010, wrongly, as I shall argue in the following, that Shaw's investigation has disproved my suggestion that the figure of the torso had acted to his left. Next, Nano Marinatos did not adapt Shaw's reconstruction and interpretation of the figure, but has found Evans's and Gillian Field's reconstruction and interpretation the most likely one. As a parallel for the Priest King's crown, she has pointed to the headgear of a male figure, probably a god, on a ring impression from Knossos above left. However, this figure does not wear a lily crown, but a beret-like headgear with a feather, similar to that of the two deities on the chariot drawn by griffins on one narrow side of the sarcophagus of Agia Triada, below left. Nano Marinatos did not state if she also follows Evans' hypothesis according to which the Priest King had guided a griffin. Next. However, in a slightly modified version of the Priest King, she has, without further comment, given the figure a scepter in the hand of the backward outstretched left arm, which makes the figure similar to the reconstructions of Gillian Père. And next, she has further pointed to the representation of the Hittite prince Kuvala-Namuva on the rock relief at Hainery, which according to her resembles the Priest King in Evans's and Gillian Field's reconstruction. Next, however, in these statements, in Shaw's reconstruction, Coulombe's fundamental anatomical observation of the clearly different tension and slant of the pectoral muscles of the Priest King torso has been ignored. Shaw's statement that, I quote, left and right pectorals differ only slightly in the angle of slant, through hardly enough to justify an accurately raised left arm, as in the more recent reconstruction is deceptive. As described before, and as is clear from the photograph on the left, the right pectoral is contracted, whereas the left one is obviously stretched out. This difference is obscured in Shaw's drawing of her reconstruction. Next, Moreover, the Near Eastern and Egyptian representations of gods and rulers cited by Shaw as parallels for the attitude of her reconstruction of the priest king are different. Pharaoh Djoser above left, depicted in a cultic race on a relief at Saqqara, and the gods or rulers approached by processional figures in a frieze on the stele of Ur-Nammu from Ur, below left, are not looking in the direction of the arm bent against the chest, but in that of the other one holding a scepter. Next, thus they are more similar to our reconstruction of the priest king than Shaw's, as is also the king, next, or prince of the Hittite relief compared by Nano Marinatos, since he also does not look in the direction of the bent arm, but towards his outstretched one, in which he holds a lance in a commanding gesture comparable to that of our reconstruction of the priest king. What I had overlooked next, in our 1987 reconstruction of the figure, following the prototype of the master impression, is the fact that the hair of the latter is not visible above the shoulders, but is falling completely behind his head. Following this, my wife Barbara and I next have corrected our reconstruction, as you can see here. In 2017, Fritz Blackholmer has granted that the reconstruction of the priest king by Gillian Fiel causes major iconographical problems, but has continued, and next, I quote, "From a methodological point of view, we may ask whether the putting together of the fragments of 2 arms, 2 feet, a torso, and a headgear really does deserve the modern criticism of being largely a speculative invention," so Alexandre Fanou, 1995. And I continue with Blackholmer, cannot this critique also apply, and to an even greater extent, to reconstructions of this material as a boxing scene or a multi-figural scene consisting of a god, a sphinx, and a priestess, as proposed in the 1980s? In an earlier article of 2004, Blackholmer has stated that the restorations of the Gillians are often superior to modern positivism and minimalism. I have to oppose resolutely these statements. In the pioneer times of the beginning of the 20th century, Evans and the Gillians did not have parallels available for the figures and compositions of their often ingenious but mostly intuitive reconstructions of the Cnossian murals. According to Cameron, out of 70 or so restorations of Aegean Bronze Age wall paintings known to him, over 50 contain clear errors. I think that it is our scholarly duty not to accept unquestioningly the reconstructions of Gillian Fiel, but to scrutinize them and to make corrections and changes based on new evidence. Gillian Fiel has been seen also critical in archaeological circles, although not in public. Next. When Sir Arthur Evans organized in 1936, in connection with the 50th anniversary celebration of the British School at Athens, an exhibition on Knossos in Burlington House, London. Next, Edith Eccles invited in a letter Spiridon Marinatos to visit that exhibition, but continued, I quote, "I am afraid you would be rather shocked. It is as much Gillianesque as Minoan, perhaps more." She would not have written this if Marinatos would not have also thought critically about Gillian. Whereas the reconstructions of the priest king by Evans and the Gillians were intuitive without the use of iconographical parallels, which they didn't have, and guided by the urgent wish to have a representation of the priestly king of Knossos, I have based our reconstruction on parallels in my known iconography, of which we have many more examples today than Evans and the Gillians had, especially in glyptics. Next. Figures with one arm bent against the body and the other outstretched holding a staff scepter appear on several seals and seal impressions. Few examples here. Similar is also the prince on the chieftain's cup from Agia Triada. I would not claim that our reconstruction of the priest king's torso is absolutely certain, but I think that it has the highest probability of all reconstructions as yet proposed. Next. According to the thorough discussion by Eric Hallager, there are two possibilities to interpret the master impression, the master of the master impression. He presents either a king expressing his power or the epiphany of a god. The same counts for our reconstruction of the priest king. Therewith we enter two controversial minefields, that of Minoan kingship and that of Minoan religion. The missing ruler in Minoan iconography, to use the expression by Alan Davis, has directed several scholars to deny the existence of kingship in Minoan Crete. Next. Lady Helen Waterhouse argued that the Minoan palaces were rather temples and that the elites living in them consisted chiefly of women priestesses, which are predominant in the cult scenes of the Knossian wall paintings, whereas no kingly figure presides over any scene of ceremony. Next, however, women play a dominant role also in the cult scenes in the wall paintings of the Mycenaean palaces. There's also a striking dearth of royal figures, although we know that the Mycenaean states were ruled by a king with the title Vanax. I would agree with Ellen Adams that, I quote, the fact that the people of mainland Greece continued to depict strong women reminds us that figural imagery does not necessarily reflect political structure as a simplistic snapshot, and that art and administration may signify different realities. Moreover, as Mark Cameron has stated, I quote, indeed, the function of men in Minoan frescoes has been underestimated. Nano Marinatos, while stressing the importance of women, has noted that men as well are shown in conspicuous positions in Knossian frescoes, pointing to the priest king and, next, to the palanquin fresco. The latter one, according to Evans's and Julien Pere's reconstruction above, representing the transport of an important male figure in a palanquin, called by Evans sedia gestatoria, carried by sacerdotal bearers in which a papare may himself be accommodated. Lower left you see the clay model of a palanquin from Knossos. Mark Cameron added more fragments to this fresco. From them it is clear that two seating men were represented. In Nano Marinatos' sketch restoration below, the two men are sitting inside a wooden stand and watching a procession, or they are recipients of tribute. Next, as Ute Günkel-Maschek has shown in her new analysis of the wall paintings in the corridor of the processions, this did not represent the veneration of a goddess or of the main priestess or the queen, but the perpetuation of the processions of males and females moving from the town into the palace and carrying valuable offerings like metal, vessels, and textiles. They are awaited, the lower picture, by male palace officials dressed in high skirts and standing, if you look there, on a little higher level to receive the offerings. It is true, next, that women played a major role in the miniature frescoes named Sacred Grove and Dance fresco above and Grandstand fresco below. They both represent religious festivals which decorated a small chamber sanctuary in the northwest of the palace at Knossos. Upper right, a reconstruction by Mark Cameron. And the next, from the same deposit originated another set of fresco fragments showing a group of men shaking javelins and of a man with long hair holding a staff or spear in the hand of his lowered left arm and having the right arm, most of it is unfortunately lost, somewhat raised. Evans believed that these fragments belong to the representation of an attack on a town. No further evidence exists, however, for representation of that character, and there would also be no space for it in the small chamber. And the next, Nano Marinatos has argued that the fragments in question can be easily connected with the festival theme, and that the males were the protagonist in another section of the Sacred Grove and Dance fresco on the right, the subject of which was a parade of arms, not uncommon in religious state festivals. The single man with a staff appears especially interesting. Next. His attitude seemed to Evans similar to that of the prince of the chieftains cut from Agia Triada? Could he be the king supervising the festival? I will come back to that. Next. Yiannis Chamilakis has argued, as others before him, that Evans, in his conception of the Cnossian monarchy, was deeply influenced by the social and political climate of Victorian and Edwardian Britain, and looked for and found with Knossos a palatial structure that would mirror the British monarchy. Knossos, in the vision of Evans, has, however, almost nothing in common with Buckingham Palace. Evans' concept of the priest king does not contain any Victorian Edwardian features. Rather, it was formed in comparison to the sacred kingships of the ancient Near East and Egypt, about which studies were published just at the time of the beginning of the excavation at Knossos. According to Chamilakis, competing factions, I quote, might have operated in around palatial sites and might have been engaged in frequent events of vast competitive conspicuous display of monumentality, expenditure and consumption in a continuous attempt to outcompete other factions. However, there is no archaeological or iconographical evidence for such factions as imagined by Chamilakis. Moreover, in comparison to the contemporary civilization of the Near East and Egypt, with which Minoan Crete was in contact, Chamilakis' model appears anachronistic, as also the other recent model suggested by Jan Driessen, according to which, in just the opposite direction, bottom-up driven corporate groups without central authorities were responsible for the construction of the palaces, using them as gathering places. Next. The planned nature of the palaces, following a modular grid, their monumentality, the investment of enormous resources, and the ability to mobilize a great workforce can hardly be explained without the existence of some central authority, as has been argued by Philip Bettencourt and Colin Macdonald. Next. Evidence for the existence of central authorities in Minoan Crete is further provided by the Egyptian sources. During the early 18th dynasty, a group of tombs of high officials in Egyptian Thebes were decorated with friezes in which tribute from foreign countries were delivered to them, as here in the tomb of Rechmiré. One of these countries is Keftiu, which means Crete. It's the second register from above. And the next, the corresponding inscription reads, "Coming in peace by the chiefs," Jean Vercoute translates kings, "of Keftiu and the islands in the midst of the great Green Sea, bowing down and bending the head to the might of His Majesty, the King of Upper and Lower Egypt," and so on. Next. Effie and Yiannis Sakellaraki have convincingly argued that the Egyptians, with the term Keftiu and islands in the middle of the Great Sea, are speaking of a big island, the country of Keftiu Crete, as political center of a larger island complex in the Aegean. This corresponds to the later tradition, the Colin, by the congruence of tradition and geological finds of several of the Aegean islands and places at the southwest coast of Asia Minor, and Malcolm Wiener and I have argued elsewhere. Next. In the tomb of Macdonald.
Wolf, can I ask you
Next.
to repeat
from
the beginning of the slide, please? Because there was some problem with the connection. Sorry about that.
What? I should repeat? I didn't understand what I should repeat.
Yes, the beginning of the slide, when you said next.
It's okay now. It's okay. It's okay. In the tomb of Menche Peresonop, the Keftiu tribute bringers are in the first register. The inscriptions are very similar to those in the tomb of Rechmiré, but here the chiefs which guide the tribute bearers are named above their representations. The first one is the chief or king of Keftiu. It's the hieroglyph lower left. And what about the missing ruler in Minoan art as postulated by Alan Davis? Next. It is true that there are no monumental representations of rulers in Crete as in the Near East and Egypt, but we find them in smaller works of art. And the next. Most of scholars have seen in the prince of the serpentine chieftain's cup from Agia Triada the representation of a commander, prince, or king. He is standing in an attitude very similar to that of the master impression, holding in the hand of the outstretched right arm a staff in the gesture of command. In difference to the master, the left arm is not bent against the upper part of the body, but lowered to the thigh. The prince next, the prince of the chieftain's cup, stands in front of a building, a palace, indicated by a vertical lines of rectangular blocks, probably imitating ashlar masonry. In front of him, to the left, stands a similar but smaller and less ornamented man with his head differentially inclined and holding a sword in his right hand and a crooked object in his left hand. He is leading 3 men behind him carrying large hides. These hides, the next, were according to John Forsyth probably those of bulls, dedicated for the manufacture of great figure of 8 shields, as they were represented in a wall painting in the loggia of the Hall of the Colonnades in the palace at Knossos. And the next, Forsyth saw in the prince of the chieftain cup King Minos, to whom the bull's hides are ceremonially presented. Alan Davis has refused this interpretation and has followed Robert Kerr's reading of the figures of the cup as conducting a rite of a passage ceremony. Kerr bases his theory on a passage of the 4th century BC author Ephoros describing an initiation ritual in Doric Crete, according to which a nobleman called the Philetor or lover selected a specific youth and abducted him to the countryside for 2 months of hunting and feasting. At the end of this period, the lover would give the youth 3 gifts, a military gear, an ox, and a drinking cup. At the end, the youth would offer the ox to Zeus. Kerr has followed Ronald Willits, who suggested that this rite handed down by Ephoros might reflect a Minoan initiation rite, whose participants were the elite corps of the aristocratic youth forming part of the court life of Minoan Knossos. This appears, however, to me unlikely, since the Doric society of the 1st millennium BC Crete was monumentally different from the Minoan palace society of the 2nd millennium BC. Moreover, I cannot accept Kerr's interpretation of the composition of the chieftain's cup. According to him, it shows the state of initiation after the period of 2 months in the country had ended, and after the return of the participants to the society. He argued that the prince is not receiving the bull hides, but actually is presenting the military gear, the ox, and the cup, which is the chieftain's cup itself, to the initiant standing in front of him. Kerr's initiant wears, however, no military gear, but holds only a sword, which has not necessarily a military function, but may have a ritual one in connection with sacrifice, as argued by Forsyth and Imar Kilian Dillmeier. There are 3 ox or bull hides instead of 1 living ox, which is sacrificed in Ephoros' description only later by the initiant. The staff is an important insignium dignitatis, indicating the very high status of the figure holding it. Next, in the arts of Egypt and the Near East, staffs are held as insignia dignitatis by kings and high officials. In front of them, when receiving persons in audience, as here, or next, receiving offerings, which you can see here. It is in this sense that we have to understand the figure holding the staff on the chieftain's cup. Next. He, and not Kerr's initiant, is a main figure to whom the bull hides are offered. Forsyth's interpretation of the scene of the chieftain's cup appears therefore convincing. In addition, according to Thomas Palaima, the staff is what the Mycenaeans called skeptron, which they brought from Minoan Crete into their remarkably anonymous and non-represented ritual of kingships, and used it with other kinds of Minoan symbols and ideas to authorize the Vanax as a paramount figure in Minoan society. Next, a linear A sign adopted in linear B represents a throne and a scepter symbolically placed over the seat. And next, of importance for the question of the existence of Minoan kings is a document not discussed by Ellen Davis, the representation on seal impressions of a gold ring from Knossos as Mother of the known as Mother of the Mountains. The center of the scene is taken by a female figure holding a staff scepter in a gesture of command and standing on a scaled mountain, a Near Eastern convention, as you can see on the right. Two lions flank the female. From the right, she receives the adoration of a male votary dressed in the loincloth of Sapouna-Sakellaraki type Zeta. On the left, we see a palace-sized structure with horns of consecrations. Next, the combining of peak and palace recalls the well-known deep link between the palace, you went too far, yeah. The combination of peak and palace recalls the well-known deep link between the palace as a religious center and the peak sanctuaries in the New Palace period, particularly that on Mount Euphrates with Knossos. The votary's large size and his direct relationship to the goddess suggest that he is not just any worshipper, but the king of Knossos. According to the interpretation of the scene by Bogdan Rutkowski, the goddess is endowing the king with his royal power by handing over to him the staff scepter. As Christos Bolotis has expressed it, I quote, peak sanctuaries, palaces, and scepters on the Knossos ceilings at least seem to provide the central message of the representation and form part of the symbolic trappings that support and affirm the institution of Minoan kingship. And the next, Olivier Pelon has further placed the scene of the Mother of the Mountains in a conceptual Near Eastern context by comparing scenes of deities endowing the king with royal power in Mesopotamian art. The wall painting on the south wall of Court 106 in the Palace of Mari, left, shows the goddess Ishtar placing her foot on one of the lions, usually accompanying her, and presenting to Zimri Lim, the last king of Mari, the attributes of royal power, the scepter in shape of a staff and the ring. A similar scene is to be found on the Babylonian stele known as the Codex Hammurabi on the right. The great Babylonian god Shamash, sitting on his throne with his feet placed on a mountain, presents the same symbols of power to King Hammurabi of Babylon, who is standing in front of him with the same attitude of veneration as Zimri Lim in front of Ishtar. In the Sumerian king list, the royalty is evoked, I quote, when the crown of kingdom descends from the sky, when the scepter and the throne descend from the sky, end of quote. Thus the emblems of royal power come directly from the gods. Royalty on earth does not exist without them. And the next, the male figure with a staff connected to the sacred grove and dance fresco from Knossos, left as a possible representation of the king supervising the festival, has already been mentioned. Of importance in this connection is also the representation on a ring impression from Zacro on the right. On the left stands a man in a posture of authority holding a staff. To the right of him, a man bows down to the ground. Further to right, two figures in long robes are witnessing the event. This is a scene of proskinesis, an act of prostration and kissing the ground in front of the king, which is known from the Near East and Egypt. Next, a common motif in royal Egyptian iconography from the 11th dynasty on shows the pharaoh killing his enemies. This was replicated on a gold ring, the impression of which has been found at Agia Triada. A male with long hair and a necklace grabs his adversary by his hair and kills him with a sword or lance. The parallel suggests that the victorious figure of the Agia Triada ceiling is the king. And the next, the so-called runner's ring found in the sanctuary of Katosimi has been interpreted by the excavators Angeliki Lembesi, Polymnia Muli, and Georgios Papasavas as dedication by an athlete who had won an important race. As Nano Marinatos has discussed, the scene does not show, however, an ordinary athletic event. as is indicated by the shooting star above the runner, and the object held by the male figure with a hide skirt on the left. This is a so-called snake frame, an attribute as held by a goddess in representations on seal as on that to the right. And the next, the Egyptian pharaoh, here to the right again Pharaoh Djoser, had to perform a cultic race during the Hepset festival because it was important for him to display his strength and bodily vigor. Therefore, the runner of the Katosimi ring is most probably the Minoan king. And next, as to Minoan religion, Evans believed that it was essentially monotheistic in character, with a great mother and nature goddess attended by her son, a dying and rising young male god who symbolized the agricultural cycle. The idea of a single great goddess was widely disputed at that time, and Evans's view was almost universally accepted due to his high authority and is alive still today. The first scholar doubting this view was Martin Nielsen, who considered in 1925, I quote, very possible that the Minoans had a multitude of gods. Indeed, this is likely to judge by other peoples with a similar or somewhat less developed culture. Evans conceded in a personal letter to Nielsen that he regarded his view of the Great Mother Goddess as a provisional formula and took into consideration the probability that in reality the Minoans knew a plurality of deities, but that he thought that, I quote, as a provisional procedure it is convenient, in default of more definite knowledge, to treat the goddess as essentially the name Great Nature Goddess under various aspects, end of quote. In 1950, Nielsen argued that there was a Minoan pantheon with several distinct goddesses as well as significant male gods. Next, he was confirmed after the decipherment of the Mycenaean Linear B script by Michael Ventris in 1952. In the Linear B text from Knossos appear beside Mycenaean Greek deities which survived into the first millennium, several female and male deities almost certainly of Minoan origin who did not survive. Next, there is also iconographical evidence for the existence of female and male deities. For instance, on a gold ring found in a grave at Poros, the harbor town of Knossos, a sacred conversation between a seated goddess flanked by birds to the left and a god, a male god in the center, is represented. And the next, the vexed problem of identifying individual deities in Minoan iconography will not enter here by me. In contrast with the Near East and Egypt, there are no special forms of dress or attribute which distinguish deities. They are rather shown like high status humans. I confine here myself to two representations of male figures with a commanding gesture in religious scenes on the gold rings, certainly to be identified as male gods. These show the same scheme of composition as the Mother of the Mountain seal image. A deity in the center, an adorant on the one, and architecture on the other side. On the so-called Epiphany ring from Knossos in Oxford, lower left, the epiphany of a male god is hovering in distance in the air. His attitude, with the commanding gesture of the outstretched right arm holding the stiff scepter in the hand, and the left arm bent against the upper part of the body, corresponds to that of the master impression. To the right are a pillar and a tree shrine. To the left stands a female votary of high rank. She may be the queen according to Nano Marinatos. The composition of a gold ring in Berlin, lower right, is very similar to that of the Oxford Epiphany ring, with the distinction that the god is standing on the same level as the female adorant and the shrine. In distinction to the main figure of the Epiphany ring and the master impression, the god on the Berlin ring is not holding a staff in the hand of his outstretched right arm. And the next. Now we come back to the master impression from Hanya, which according to Christos Bolotis provides the most powerful and emblematic image in all Aegean art of high authority expressed through the scepter, end of quote. Whereas Eric Hallager did not commit himself as to whether the master was a god or king, the majority of scholars has interpreted him as a god. The objects hovering in the air around the figure, next, belong to a group of hovering symbols indicating in Minoan glyptic representations communication between the supernatural world and the world of mortals, here some on gold rings. And next, since the hovering objects on the master impression are unfortunately not identifiable, no more precise interpretation is possible. According to Halaga, they suggest that the master, I quote, may represent either the epiphany of the male god or a human being who is entitled in his own right to participate in or perform religious ceremonies, end of quote. Next, only Olivier Pelon has been definite that the king is represented on the master impression. According to him, the mother of the mountain seal image from Knossos and the master impression from Hanya show two successive phases. The first one, the installation of the king by the goddess. The second one, his portrait in majesty on top of the palace, symbolizing perfectly his power. But does it really matter if you see a god or a ruler in the master of the master impression? As Christos Bolotis has aptly stated, the scepter, I quote, is decidedly the instrument by which power and religious authority was transferred from divine to the human sphere. Because it is carried by both deities and rulers, however, we are led to a common ground, particularly for theocratic kingship, where roles and paraphernalia are exchanged between divinity and ruler, both in ritual praxis and in imagery. Thus, the dilemma of whether the young male figure on the Chania ceiling is a deity or ruler does not really matter in the search for the latter's image, since the pictorial representation of the deity would be a projection of the ruling class of the palatial society. The staff scepter held by the supreme deity or deities in this characteristic formulaic manner is, in fact, nothing else but the scepter of the supreme archon, the ruler. End of quote. Or, in the words of Nano Marinatos, quote, the god is like the ruler and the ruler is like a god. Mythical and ideological manifestations converge on this representation. As mentioned above, traces of red color were distinguished on the ear of the fragment with the crown of the priest king during the restoration work. Next, as Georgios Rethinking has kindly reminded me, the ear of the so-called young priestess on a fresco from the West House at Akroterion, Thera, left, is red, and he has pointed out to me that the female figure with the crown on the Agia Triada sarcophagus, right, convincingly identified by Nanomarinatos as representation of the queen in her function as high priestess, has a thick curving band of red inside the ear following its outline. Therefore, next, I think that the crown of the priest king stucco relief was not worn by a sphinx, but by the queen. It appears of interest that in the royal shaft graves of Mycenae, elaborate diadems or crowns, some of them with flowers attached to their upper edges, and thus comparable to the more sophisticated crown of the priest king stucco relief, decorated the heads only of women, not of men. Next. As the result of the discussion on the exchange of role between gods and king, I am no longer convinced that the male with the torso of the priest king stucco relief reconstructed by me is necessarily a god. He can also be the king. Thus, Evans's interpretation of the priest king stucco relief is probably correct. Only the direction and the attitude of the figure needs to be changed, and the crown needs to be taken away from him and to be given to the queen, who appears to approach him from the right. Next. Possibly in a procession similar to my suggestion number 1 of 1987, in a ceremony of sacred marriage. In Egypt, sacred marriage was practiced between the pharaoh and his consort who posed as Hathor. In several cities of Mesopotamia, the New Year's festival, bringing on the rainy season and fertility, culminated in the ritual reenactment of the sacred marriage. The deified king of each city-state would perform the role of the consort, while the queen, in her role as high priestess, was the avatar of the goddess. Next. A scene of a sacred marriage in Minoan Crete appears to be represented on a Minoan II seal impression from Festos. A man holds hands with a woman wearing a long dress. Between the figure is an object which, according to Nano Marinatos, may be a sword. I think it can also be a staff scepter. According to Marinatos, the branch above the woman may be a sign associating the union with a vegetation festival. This reminds the Mesopotamian New Year's festival. And the next? The vast lilies of the necklace and of the crown, linking the king and the queen of the reconstruction of the fragments of the Priest King stucco relief as suggested by me, point in the same direction. The vase lily, a combination of lily and papyrus, has clear sacral association, as had been discussed by Peter Warren. The papyrus stood in Egypt for life, afterlife, and fertility, and was joined in Minoan art with the lily to reinforce the rebirth and fertility symbolism as argued by Helen Hughes Brock. Next. The lilies and the butterfly are also to understand in this context. Moreover, the butterfly can be regarded as a flying messenger of the divine sphere, as on several glyptic representations, which you see on the right. Next, the stucco relief, now interpreted by me as representing the sacred marriage between king and queen, probably adorned the walls in the south wing of the palace of an important room in the upper floor above the basement in which the fragment has fallen. As already thought by Alan Weiss in 1927, argued by me in 1987, and accepted by Sinclair Hood and Nicoletta Momigliano in 1994. And the last one? After all, Gillian Field's Priest King in the Heraclean Museum will certainly survive all carpings and critics. As Barry Unsworth has stated, and I quote, "In the course of the centuries since he was put together, the prince has taken on symbolic force. The fresco is a false image that exposure to millions of people has made true, embedded in the popular imagination as the essential expression of the Minoan elegance and vivacity of spirit. The original is still on display in the Heraclean Museum. A copy still stands under the portico of the south entrance of the palace at Knossos, where Evans placed it in 1976. Potent proof, 1926, potent proof, if we needed one, of the power of the image to transcend objective categories of truth and falsehood. I thank you for your patience. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you very much. I think I speak on behalf of everybody if I say just if I say a warm thanks to Wolf for this particular rich presentation. He tackled a broad area of issues from iconography to political authority and religion. As you can imagine, it is impossible to make a proper discussion with the main microphones switched on. And your microphones also are switched off by default. So I would like to ask you, if you want to pose a question, there are several ways to do it. Either write in the chat your question, and I'm going to transfer it to Wolf, or write in the chat that you would like to pose a question, and then I can switch on your microphone for you. And or alternatively, you can switch on your camera and wave, something like that. I hope I will be able to see it, and switch on your microphone. The other way would be to switch on all microphones and then allow you to switch on your microphone. But I'm afraid that if you're going to try to do it 3 or 4 or 5 altogether, we're not going to hear anything. So please let me know in the chat or by waving your hand in the screen that you would like to ask a question or make a comment or say something to Wolf on the rest. Who wants to start?
Everybody is exhausted. I spoke too long, as always.
I think perhaps I will, yes. Bob Curl, I'm going to, okay, I just sent you a request to unmute. Okay.
Okay, thank you. That was, of course, terrific and thorough and so much to think about, Wilson. Thank you. I just have a little question about the missing, the exposed neck, where you can see that it appears that the hair stops. And it almost reminds me of the same hairstyle that one sees on the Palenque fresco to which you compared it. And so if you have the hair stopping at the base of the neck, as it appears to on that fresco, I'm not quite sure about the long locks that indicate that there were long locks. In other words, I'm wondering if it's more of the hairstyle of the Palais-Castro Kouros and the Palenque fresco and the young boy on the chieftain cup rather than long hair. You see what I'm saying? Because you wouldn't otherwise see the skin, because that's usually, even on the master impression, there seems to be a thickening at the side of the neck where the hair would continue down, unless you have some other thoughts about it. But thanks again. That's great.
So also the master impression, the hair falls all together behind the head. You don't see it above the shoulder. And the priest king had long hair, because I didn't show another fragment, because under the left arm, the stretched out left arm, here is another fragment, and you see locks going down. I didn't show that because it's in the reconstruction also of the Reliance. So there is no doubt that the priest king had long hair. Mm-hmm.
If I'm allowed to speak, I know Marinatos has put a comment, which is because I made a mistake with the settings. It's private, but I guess and I would like to announce it to everybody. So she says, hello to everybody. Nice to see you. And all in this great lecture by Wolf. I am entirely convinced by this reconstruction and agree that the figure is the king. Emmels was right after all. I don't know if Wolf wants to comment on this.
Thank you, Nano. We almost always agree. This is also following the nights of discussion long time ago with Robin and Nano, which I mentioned at the beginning. So,
if Nano Marinatos would like to say something, I can send a request to unmute. And
just to say hello. And Wolf and I always agree. That's true.
Else, either wave your hand in the camera or send me a message in the chat to switch on your microphone. Colin, would you like to comment on something? You have to unmute yourself, Colin. Sorry, you have to switch on your microphone.
Yes, Wolf. One thing you didn't, it's very boring, but one thing you didn't address was the date of the fresco.
Ah, that's a good question. There's much controversy about that. So the datings, because there's no context, you can't date with a context, a fine context, only stylistically. And the problem is, so the best object for dating is a lily chain. And this, some people, you can date it to LM1A or LM1B. In pottery, it would be mostly LM1B, but on the Thera fresco, they have it similar vase lilies already in LM1A. So I would say LM1, but probably not later. Some people said LM2, but it's also possible, but I don't believe it. But it's difficult indeed. At least not later than LM2 in any case. I would say LM1A or B.
Right, and Peter Warren is about to say something.
Exactly. I just sent a request for a mute, Peter.
Peter?
Professor Warren, you can switch on your microphone. Click unmute in the lower part of the screen.
Lower left.
Lower left.
You're an expert now, Wolf.
War das jetzt?
Mhm.
No.
He needs Elizabeth to press the right button.
Lower left.
Unmute.
Ja, das ist doch vorher schon gehabt.
Anyway, I'm trying.
Why does it?
You can unmute yourself now. It's not locked anymore. In the lower part of the screen next to stop or start video, you can click unmute. I'm afraid.
He needs his wife to help him.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Is anybody else who wants to ask something or point on something?
Yes, Wolf, you're right.
Oh, sorry, Colin, you have to switch on your microphone again.
Wolf, Sinclair Hood certainly had the impression that it was probably late Minoan 1B. I think that was his opinion.
Could you just do it?
Oh, hello.
Great.
Yiannis?
Yes, we can hear you, Peter. Yes.
Yeah, just to say that if following Wolf, the Lily suggests a date of LM1, what we can say for certain is that the fresco was visible on the walls of the palace at the time of its destruction, because it must be from a final destruction context. So late Minoan 3A1, beginning of 3A2. There's no problem with that, but it does mean that it was on the walls for a long period, from LM1 right through to the destruction of the palace in the beginning of the
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Thank you.
But it's possible. We have still Renaissance frescoes on the walls.
Yes, but I'm sorry, I don't understand how we know, how we can think that it was on the walls of the palace when it was destroyed.
Well, think of the find context. It was in the fill. Wolf said how many centimeters down. It was in the destruction material, the last level, as it were, with the fragments as Evans found them in room number 5, whatever it was, in the plan. Surely it has to be from the final moment. There was no material.
Can I answer to that? The problem is, according to Mackenzie's description, the fragments were found between 30 centimeters and 2.20 meters below ground. They were not close together, and there was some disturbance in this area. So it's not necessarily the case that it really was on the floor at the last moment, because this area is much disturbed. And Mackenzie describes he didn't find a floor level until down to the Neolithic level, 3 meters below ground. So it's difficult. Unfortunately, we have no material which was found together with the fresco fragments. We don't know. So I wouldn't say that it is certain that it was on the wall of the last destruction. It is possible because, as we know, for instance, the saffron gatherer probably was also several hundred years on the wall. That is possible, but not certain. We have no certainty about that, I would say.
have two more comments, one by Constance van Ruden. Hello to everyone. Thank you very much. Just a comment. I would reconstruct a relief hand. Sorry, I have to switch off Peter Warren's microphone. Sorry about this. Okay. So Constance says, hello to everyone. Thank you very much. Just a comment. I would reconstruct a relief hand grabbing a pole in Tel El Daba, even though shown from the outside in a similar position.
Oh,
I don't know if
very interesting.
If you want, you can switch on your microphone. You want to say more about this, or we can. Okay.
Γιάννη, μπορώ να μιλήσω, η Μαρία η Βλαζάκη.
Βέβαια.
Δεν μπορώ να ανοίξω το βίντεο, κάτι έχει πάθει τώρα. Thank you very much, Wolf, for this very interesting speech. It was so exciting. I would like just to add that concerning the master impression, it was found in the Minoan Palace, of course. It's a palace there, yes. And it was found very close to the area where we had later on, of course, the linear B tablet with Zeus and Dionysus.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And also, some years ago, Eric and me excavated another place which may have to do with a shrine.
Yes.
So all this fits well together with the representation of the male figure on top of the palace to be a god, this figure, and not a king. That's what I would like to say.
Thank you very much, Maria. But I think as Nano and others, and Christos Boulotis has done a good study of this, that the roles of king and god are interchangeable, because the king has also a strong religious function, and he gets the staff from the scepter from the gods, from the deities, and so I wouldn't say that it's really there is not a hard border, so to say, between king and god in iconography.
I agree with this, but in several cases we may say what is more probable or not. In some cases, that's why I thought. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
There is a question by Jane Hickman. Saying the ears outlined in red from Xesti 3 and the Agia Triada sarcophagus have always been curious to me. Could you speak again about them and about the small fragment associated with the priest king that resembles them?
Yeah, so this was new for me. Yorgos told me that they found red color in the ear of the connected with the crown of the priest king fresco. And then he reminded me, and I had forgotten, that the priestess, young priestess, had the red ear, and also red color is in the outline of the goddess priestess, queen priestess of the Agia Triada sarcophagus. So I think this has a symbolic meaning. So of course you can speculate. Red has often very distinctive symbolic meanings. It can mean blood. It can, but for instance, can also be a sign for life, because in the Cycladic, on the Cycladic figurines, we have often also red color. But it's difficult to say. It must have some meaning, but we don't know exactly which meaning it has. But this connects the crown of the priest king, the ear there, and the priestess of Thera, and the queen, priestess of the Hagia Triada sarcophagus. More we can't say, unfortunately.
I think Bob has something related to say. Yes, please, Bob.
I just want to add also, I think the plaster head from Mycenae, she has also red lines painted inside of her ear.
I have a copy of it here. I have just a look. Let me see, Barbara. You are right. You are right. And I think, yeah, so also we don't know what it is. Some people say a sphinx, some people say a deity, but it has also, you're completely right.
Yeah. Okay.
Important, yeah. Thank you.
A more general question by Georg Nightingale. Does the message of the fresco scene, as reconstructed by you, change in comparison to the former priest king? More political, more religious, more ritual?
All three is my answer in 2 words, all 3 of them.
Another question is if there is any analysis of the stucco that shows any similarity between these fragments. Do you have any analysis of the different fragments?
No, I don't know. They did investigation. I was not engaged in that. The excellent team of the Heraclean Museum, they did a lot of research, but as far as I know, not really analysis of the colors or of the stucco, as far as I know, but this Yorgos can answer. But they did a lot of work with photographs and so on, and microscope, but not analytical work as far as I know. Yeah.
Κύριε Ρεθεμιωτάκη, μήπως θέλετε να προσθέσετε κάτι σε αυτό? Εδώ ανοίξτε το μικρόφωνο αν θέλετε.
May I add something to this? The director of the museum, as you know, to have undertaken this great task to complete the exhibition in a certain time. No more time available. So there was a dead end, and we have to comply to this. So we had no time at this certain moment to make more analysis on pigments or the plaster, and this is something which may be undertaken in the future, but not at the very time of the exhibition, which was very urgent. So this is my answer. No analysis have been made at this certain time.
Lydia Morgan would like to pose a question about the background colors. Would you like to switch on your microphone and ask directly Wolf? Lydia?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Wolf, for this very full, interesting talk. A couple of things about color, actually. But before I ask my question, just about the ear. Of course, the ladies in Xesti 3 at Akrotiri also have red inside their ears. It's a way of defining the whereas the fisherman, the well-preserved fisherman from the West House, has black defining the ear. So it's a characteristic of how to define the ear. But my question has to do with the background, because there's very clear red, the torso. So the torso obviously is against a red background, and that explains why you have a light-colored skin for a male. It's the same at Tel Odaba, for example. We have a figure of a hunter whose skin is a kind of pink color, and the pink and not red is because it's against a red background. That clarifies form by changing the color. So my question is, what is the color, or do we actually have part of the background around the legs? Is it yellow?
No, as far as I know, in the exhibition in the Heraclean Museum, there is only red color. The yellow color was supposed by Evans because of the background of the lilies and of which we don't know, unfortunately, we don't know where these fragments have gone.
Right.
They are, Mark Cameron didn't find them, and Sue Sherritt knows where these are. So there were even some doubts. Sue doubted, I had corresponded with her, that these fragments, the lily and the butterfly, really belong to that, and that it only was put there when Evans got the idea of the Elysian fields. I don't think so, because at the very beginning, in the first reconstruction of Emilie Jean Père, which I didn't show, this is only a second one, so he did several attempts. And in the first one, which you see only in small photographs, for instance, a photograph of the Ashmolean Museum and the new book on the Ashmolean Museum, you can see that the butterfly was not a butterfly, but a flower on top of the other flowers. And therefore, so it was there in the reconstructions of Émile Jean Père from the very beginning. So I think they were really found together with the relief fragments.
Thank you. So the important thing as far as the color of the skin is concerned is that all the relief fragments of three figures are all against red.
Yeah.
Yellow, thank you.
Yeah, but we have this red-brown color, the stucco relief fragments from the Great East Hall, which I showed, but they have, as far as I know, we have no background there preserved, yeah. But nevertheless, you are right, but I think still the more pale color of the priest king has also a symbolic meaning, has an importance. It's not only because of the red color.
That's possible, yes.
Yeah.
Alexios Piliotopoulou reminds us that in a recent paper published by Jason Earle in the Cosmos Conference, there was a group with women with red ears. And there are quite a few female heads with red ears among figurines as well. I guess Alexia speaks about Peak Sanctuary figurines with red ears.
Thank you very much. The problem is now in the lockdown, you can't go to libraries. So I could do not much research, only from the books I have in my library. So this is not complete. Thank you very much. I will look for that when I can go back to the libraries. Yeah.
Constanza, I read your comment, but then we lost you. If you want to add something about the Tel Daba fresco, Constanza, you still with us? Okay. If you want to add something.
Sorry, I had some technical problems and I left. I just wanted to say that we have a really nice stucco relief hand, but shown from the outside, and the angle of the hand is it shows that it is really in this higher upside position. So it would be really from the position quite similar to your reconstruction.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, if we can compare it, let's have that in the background, but it is rather similar, even though more similar to the Delos ivory piece, where also the hand is shown from the outside.
Yeah, thank you for this information.
Colin, I think, yes, please, Colin.
Sorry, Wolf, I have a question going back to Coulomb's discussion of the physique and the position of the muscles.
Yeah.
Of the missing arm.
Yeah.
And the idea was that it was somewhat raised. But you, in fact, in your reconstruction, have not raised it very much.
Yeah.
Would you allow that it might be raised further?
May, but it's not necessary much. So there's not a big difference between if you see the photograph of the model, the living model he had in his arm.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, but it must not be as high, as raised as there, I think. So,
I see. Okay, right.
But at least you can't do it like Maria Shaw to put it downwards. This is important.
No, I agree. Yes, I understand. Good. Okay.
So this is perhaps a minor difference between. So if you like this or this, it's not a big difference, I would say. Yeah. Thank you.
Yanni, you're muted.
Iphigenia, can you? Okay.
Yes, I just unmuted myself. Hello, Wolf.
Hello, Iphigenia. How are you?
I'm fine at the moment. Fine, I think. I wanted to ask you something different.
Yeah.
Because you seem to have done a lot on those investiture scenes, all those parallels and seals and frescoes and whatever, wall paintings. You've got a god and a human, powerful, elite human, or you've got an elite human and a less elite human who is given more power. Can you tell me, if you've got an overall impression, the size, what are the statistics on the size of the two figures? Is always the god or the more powerful human bigger than the person receiving power?
Unfortunately not. This would be easy. And for instance, the Mother of the Mountains ceiling, there the man is larger than the goddess, but she is far away probably.
And she's up on the mountain, yeah.
But for instance, the only example I remember now is the Berlin Ring, and there the god standing in front of the shrine has the same size as the adorant, the female adorant in front of him. There is no difference. Unfortunately, it's not so easy as in Near Eastern and Egyptian iconography, where the gods are always larger and they have their special dress and attributes, and that's our problem with the Minoan iconography, that we don't have this. But the gods have also are represented like humans of high status. And we can't from their dress, and so we can't distinguish them.
I'm asking because I was thinking about the fresco in the cult center with room 31 with the two figures, and the one on the right is doing exactly the command gesture, you know, that you get on all those males and females in Crete, but she's smaller than the figure on the left, holding a sword. So I thought whether this was an argument, convincing argument to say they're not even equal, they're just, one is smaller than the other, where you could say, no, she cannot be a goddess or more important.
I would agree. This is, of course, Mycenae and not Crete, but for instance, on the chieftain's cup, also the prince is higher than the young man with the sword standing in front of them. And sometimes we have this. But not always.
Not always, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Katerina Kovalka says also that there is an overall question of ages here too, not just males and females. Perhaps there is. I don't know if κυρία Κόπαρκα θέλετε να μιλήσετε ή...
Καλησπέρα σε όλους και ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για όλα, και την ομιλία και την ευκαιρία να ξαναδούμε όλους από τους φίλους τις φίλες. I realize that the question on iconic and aniconic, as put by Robin Hegg and Nano Marinatos many years ago, still occupies our discussions and so on. But each time we make a step forwards to each one, either one direction. I think there are young males and more mature females, very often on the rings, and all ages on frescoes, especially on those from Santorini. But there is clearly, I always think that it is a pity and a shame that we do not have small inscriptions beneath each figure saying young male, young god or a mature goddess, or I do not know. But there is a model, let's say, a repetition of ages and sexes, englyptic, microglyptic, in painting, and so on. And boys are not always, male figures are not always the same, let's say, anatomy. Anatomies also mean ages sometimes. It's just, it's not a question, but
Yeah, of course, that's right. And but we have no, in my known iconography, we have no old people at all. They are all young. We have no old, so the main figures at least are not really old. And of course, we have different ages, and Robert Cole has done a lot of work, Davis, Nano, Marinatos. It's also the haircut they have, and so they have. We have a lot of criteria for that. But the priest king appears to be a man in his best age, with long hair, no young boy or so.
Another question by Nectaria Mavroudi asking, so should we use the priest king fresco to continue the line of thinking that says the color convention of brown man, white woman can break when the purpose of the representation urges to stress different aspects other than the sex of the figure? A lot of scholars have argued about this, trying also to interpret the Knossos Toreador fresco.
Yeah, I know. That's a problem, and I think the color code was not as strict as we believed at the very beginning. I'm sorry, I'm not anti-feminist, but I don't believe in female bullipers. And so that's a problem. There may be another reason why they have different colors. I'm not sure. Oh, now I faoxilo apotin Katarina. No, I thought because I saw her name.
what I did
Before this, do you have any other? Do you have any other questions, points to be made? I think we are more than. I don't know, Colin, do you want to say something as a closing?
No, just thank you very much to everybody, and thank you very much to Wolf on behalf of Effie and Lefteris and Yiannis and myself. You know, it was great, a lovely evening.
Yeah, and I would like to thank all of you for having the patience to follow me almost half an hour. I think I didn't look at the clock, but I would also like to thank for the very interesting contributions to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. Thank you.
And hope to see you all soon again, not only on the screen, but in nature.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Good night. Thank you very much. Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye, Bobby.